There is a hill in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea that no human being has stood on since 1953. It has a name, Maryang San Hill 317. In October of 1951, 320 Australian infantrymen took it in 5 days from 1,200 Chinese, after 2 American attempts and 2 British battalions had failed on the ground around it. 20 Australians died doing it. They fired 900,000 rounds of small arms, 5,000 grenades and 7,000 mortar bombs in those 5 days, and every round came up the mountain on somebody's back. On the last night, with the ammunition gone, they killed men with their hands. 28 days later, the hill was gone, and it never came back. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of Maryang San before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about how a country decides which of its battles to remember. Now let's go. To understand why 320 men were sent up that hill, you must first understand what the Korean War had become by the autumn of 1951. The fighting had not stopped. The war had. What replaced it was a negotiation conducted at gunpoint by 2 sides who had both stopped believing they could win, and by July there were men sitting at a table at Panmunjom, saying nothing to each other for months at a time. Operation Commando was designed for that table. General James Van Fleet wanted a limited offensive in the western sector, 10 kilometers north of the 38th parallel, to seize a line of hills the planners had named Jamestown. The purpose was not a breakthrough. It was not a war-winning offensive, and nobody drafting it pretended otherwise. It was 10 kilometers of hill, purchased for use as leverage by men in a tent. The watching was the point. Maryang San rose 200 meters above the valley floor, 2.5 kilometers north of a rounded hill the British had nicknamed Little Gibraltar. From its summit, the Chinese could see every road, every gun position, and every movement the 1st Commonwealth Division made along the Imjin River. Take it, and they went back 3 kilometers and went blind. That was the whole strategic case, and it was a real one. The division holding it, the 191st of the Chinese 64th Army, had an establishment of 10,000 men and about 6,000 because it had crossed the Imjin during the 5th campaign and never recovered from what that cost. Roughly 80 guns, most of them mortars. What it had instead of equipment was an idea. The defenders were testing a doctrine the Chinese called mobile positional defense, and it was new. Rather than pack the hills with men to be pulverized by American artillery, hold each position with a small force whose job is to exhaust the attacker and bleed him, keep the mass of the division back and out of range, and counterattack the moment the exhausted attacker arrives, and before he can consolidate. Everything that happened over the following 6 days happened because of that idea. The counterattacks were not desperation. They were the plan, run by professionals who had been fighting for a decade. As for what the hill was worth, the Australian Army's own history unit has written the honest answer down. The battle had little impact on the outcome of the war. The Americans had already tried twice and failed twice. The hill was worth exactly what a better seat at Panmunjom was worth. 20 men were about to pay a different price for it entirely. Everything about what happened next suggests that the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment must have been a superb, experienced, cohesive fighting unit. It was not. The pedigree was real enough. The battalion landed at Busan in September of 1950, and 3 weeks later, at a place the diggers called the Apple Orchard, it killed 150 North Koreans and took 200 prisoners in 3 hours of close combat, for 7 Australians wounded. In the Kapyong Valley in April of 1951, it helped stop a Chinese division driving on Seoul and received the United States Presidential Unit citation for it. A brigadier would later look at that record and call the battalion Old Faithful, and the name has never come off. None of that is the same thing as being ready. By the end of September, the men who had held the line at Kapyong were going home. Their 12 months were up. Into the gap came more than 200 replacements across August and September, and they were still arriving while the battle was being fought. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett, who commanded them, described the battalion he inherited in 3 words that no official history has ever managed to soften. It was, he said, a transit camp in action. He was harsher in private. The battalion, he wrote later, was basically an organized collection of well-trained individuals which had been strung out in a defensive position for the past 3 months, and was quite unpracticed as a unit in the battle procedures and techniques required for a battalion in attack. The preparedness of the companies for offensive operations, he said, was low. That is a commanding officer's assessment of his own men, written by a man with every professional incentive to say something else. The new arrivals were volunteers of a particular kind, and Hassett understood exactly what he had. They were K-Force volunteers, he wrote, patriotic and adventurous young men fired up by the experiences and stories of the Second World War, which meant that a battalion about to attack a fortified mountain contained 2 populations who did not entirely trust each other. Men who had already seen what the Chinese could do in the dark, and men who had come halfway around the world to find out. The arithmetic underneath was worse than the mood. Rifle companies that should have held 140 men were running at 70 to 90. Platoons were under 25. D Company, which would lead the assault, had 72 men. C Company was commanded by a major named Jack Girk, and Girk was the only officer in his company who had ever been under fire. 2 of his platoon commanders, Maury Piers and Arthur Pembroke, had graduated from Duntroon in December of 1950 and arrived in Korea in July. They had been soldiers for 9 months. Major Basil Hardiman commanded D Company, and when Hassett told him that his 72 men would be first onto the mountain, Hardiman remembered that his heart stopped for a second. "I thought how unprepared we were for such an operation," he said afterwards. "Too many new faces, lacking some items of equipment, and not fit enough for a long, tough attack." We had spent the last 3 months in defense. In attack, you use entirely different muscles to defense. That was the battalion. Hundreds of men short of establishment, a third of them strangers to each other, 3 months out of practice at attacking anything at all. In 72 hours, it would be asked to do what the United States Army had already failed to do twice. The man doing the asking was 33 years old and had never commanded anything in a battle in his life. Francis George Hassett was born in April of 1918 in Marrickville, in Sydney, the son of a railway yard manager. He left school at 15 for clerical work with the Department of Tramways, and he got into the Royal Military College at Duntroon aged 16, only because the chairman of the selection board gave him special consideration. He captained the college rugby 15. He scored a winger's try against the All Blacks. At Tobruk, laying white tapes to mark a start line on the eve of the attack, racing the dawn, he stopped crawling and prodding for mines and started walking, and one blew up. He carried the shrapnel in his foot afterwards. He was promoted lieutenant colonel in 1942. At 23, the youngest man ever to hold that rank in the Australian Army. And then the Army made him a staff officer and kept him one. And he finished the Second World War without ever having commanded troops in action. He came to Korea in June of 1951 to take over the 3rd Battalion, and he took command without ever meeting the man he replaced. He had 10 weeks. His brigadier was an Englishman named George Taylor, described by one contemporary as the product of an old North Country Catholic family, gregarious, extrovert, a lover of good food, wines, and jovial company. Taylor built the plan in 3 phases. On the 3rd of October, the brigade would take Little Gibraltar. On the 4th, the Canadians would take a pair of features to the west. On the 5th, the brigade would take Hills 2, 1, 7 and 317. His two British commanding officers read it and told him what they thought of it, and one of them warned that it might cost the brigade 1,000 casualties. The ridge running north to Hill 317 was to be assaulted by the 1st Battalion of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, and the brigade named its features accordingly. Hill 217 became Newcastle. Beyond it lay United, then Football, then Club. Football would later be renamed The Hinge, and Club would become The Knoll. But that was the naming on the map when the orders went out. Men from Newcastle were ordered to attack up a ridge called Newcastle, United, Football, and Club. 20 of them died on it. Hassett said nothing about Taylor's plan in public. He was the new boy and a colonial on top of it, and while his British colleagues attacked the plan in the open, he kept his own counsel and stayed loyal to his brigadier. And then, quietly, he went to Taylor and talked him out of the single worst thing in it. Taylor had directed the Australians to attack Maryang San frontally, across the valley, straight up the eastern face. That was precisely the approach that had already destroyed 2 American attacks, because the valley was wide and open, and every metre of it was covered by machine guns firing along the slope from positions that supported each other. Hassett asked for it to be withdrawn. Taylor withdrew it. What Hassett wanted instead, he had learned in New Guinea, watching Australian commanders handle Japanese positions in country that looked a great deal like this. It was called running the ridges, and it meant refusing the obvious ground entirely. Do not go up the sides. Go along the crest. Cross the valley in the dark. Put the companies onto the enemy's flank among the foothills before dawn, and climb the spine of the mountain at first light, with a company making as much noise as possible down in the valley with the Centurion tanks. The assault companies would have to navigate silently, at night, over hills of thick timber and long grass, and arrive close enough to the Chinese fortifications to be among the defenders with grenade, bullet, butt, and bayonet before anybody was properly awake. The arithmetic he was working against does not require any dramatization. Doctrine then, and doctrine now, wants 3 attackers for every defender in a deliberate attack on a prepared position. Hassett had 320 men in his 4 rifle companies. Waiting for them were about 1,200. The historian Bob Breen, writing for the Australian Army about its own battle, put the modern verdict plainly. It would have been unthinkable, he wrote, for an Australian national commander to have signed off on this attack plan during recent operations in Iraq or in Afghanistan. The plan depended entirely on 320 exhausted strangers arriving silently, in darkness, in fog, in exactly the right place. The fog was the one thing nobody could plan. Lieutenant Jim Hughes had just taken over 4 platoon of B Company, and the battle he was walking into was the first time in his life he had been shot at. Half a century later, he described the approach march along the Imjin, and it remains the best sentence anybody who was there ever produced about it. The fog was so thick, he said, that every man held onto the bayonet scabbard of the man in front of him. At 3 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of October, B Company moved 2,000 metres north across the open valley toward a low feature called Hill 199, walking in darkness and heavy mist through ground that would have killed them in daylight. At 8, they had the high ground and took it for 3 men wounded, killing 5 Chinese and capturing 1. They dug in and waited for the counterattack. It never came. At 7:15 that morning, the 1st Battalion of the King's Own Scottish Borderers began their assault on Little Gibraltar. And everything that had gone right for the Australians went wrong for them, for one reason. The Chinese were expecting an attack from exactly that direction. The Borderers walked into prepared fire from men who had worked out which way they were coming and had been waiting for weeks. Among the dead was Corporal James Ritchie Cron, 29 years old, who left a wife, a 2-year-old son, and his parents, and whose name is cut into the war memorial at Garliston in Wigtownshire, where the road runs down to the water. By nightfall, the battalion was consolidated more than 1,000 yards short of the summit, and the brigade was a day behind schedule before it had properly started. Into the second morning of the battle, at 5:30, with the fog still down, walked a company commanded by the only officer in it who had ever been shot at. Girk took C Company out into the dark, and by 9:15 he was on the first of two knolls that had been holding up the borderers, and the brigade war diary records what happened to the defenders in 2 words: completely routed. He kept going. From 10 in the morning until 12:15, his men fought along the saddle to the second knoll, hand to hand at the end of it, with the platoon of 21-year-old Maury Piers leading. And then Girk did something he had been explicitly ordered not to do. The brigade had told the Australians not to cross a particular grid line on the map, which in plain language meant, do not go to the summit, that summit belongs to the borderers. Girk pushed a platoon toward it anyway, and the official history notes, without further comment, that he had received no orders to do so. On the other side of the hill, a British major called for a piper. Major George Duncan commanded a company of the borderers, and coming up behind a company that had been thrown back the day before, he made a judgment that would be very difficult to defend in front of a modern staff college. Second Lieutenant Jock Furless watched him do it. He sent for the pipe major, and the two of them led the company in with the pipe major playing the regimental charge, which Furless believed was probably the last time anybody went into action in a Scottish regiment behind a piper. Duncan carried a walking stick, which was his trademark, and he was silhouetted on the ridge line in daylight in front of a hill full of machine guns. And he was unscathed, Furless said. The pipe major was unscathed, and the company never stopped. There has to be a relationship between those things. The Chinese on Little Gibraltar were now being assaulted from 2 directions at once by men who would clearly keep coming, and they did what professionals do. They left. They withdrew to the northwest under heavy artillery fire, in good order, having decided that the position no longer paid. It had cost the Australians 11 wounded, one of whom died. Gurkha was given the Distinguished Service Order. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Gurkha got on the radio and reported that he held Little Gibraltar, and that the borderers were still below the summit, making their way steadily upwards. Gurkha was certain of what he had seen. He would be certain of it for the rest of his life. Nobody had any reason yet to check. At 4:45 on the morning of the 5th of October, B and D companies moved north across the valley into the fog, and the plan that Hassett had spent 10 weeks earning the right to write began to come apart in the first hour, quietly, in 3 separate places at once. The Fusiliers went first and were supposed to attack at 5:45. In the mist, they could not hold their bearings. Their assault finally went in at 11 o'clock, 5 hours and a quarter late, against a hill that had spent the whole morning listening to them coming. B Company drifted right. Captain Henry Nichols led them off in the mist through vegetation nobody could see through, lost the axis of advance, and took no part in the assault at all, ending up as flank protection for a battle they had been meant to open. The battalion attack that Hassett had designed had ceased to exist before contact. What was left was a series of separate company attacks that nobody had planned and nobody was coordinating. Which left D Company, 72 men under a major who had already told his commanding officer he did not think they were ready, climbing an open slope in fog toward 1,200 Chinese. At 11:20 in the morning, the mist lifted. It went all at once, the way it does in that country, and what it uncovered was D Company standing halfway up a bare slope in full daylight underneath a prepared position. There was no cover. There was no possibility of going back, and the Chinese did not fire because the Chinese were facing the wrong way. They had expected the assault to come from the north, and their machine guns were dug in pointing south, and there was no time to turn them. 2 days earlier, the borderers had walked into fire from men who knew exactly which way they were coming. Now, on the same mountain, the reverse had happened. And it had happened because a colonial lieutenant colonel with no combat command had talked his brigadier out of the obvious approach. A medium machine gun did find D Company headquarters, and it wounded Hardeman, and it wounded Lieutenant Jeff Leary, and command fell to Lieutenant Jim Young. All 3 of the company's platoons were now being led by their sergeants. One of them was Bill Rowlandson, who already had the Distinguished Conduct Medal, won at Kapyong 6 months earlier, and who would leave that mountain with a bar to it. The fight for the first objective took 20 minutes, and was conducted at a range at which nobody misses. Point-blank shooting, grenades, bayonets, the tanks firing directly into the bunkers from the valley below. It cost 3 Australians killed and 12 wounded, and it killed 30 Chinese and took 10 prisoners. By 4 in the afternoon, Young and the remnant of D Company had taken the last of their intermediate objectives, and Hassett made the decision. The battle turned on. He could see that Young's men were nearly finished, and he calculated that if he sent them at the summit, they might take it, and then be too spent to hold it, which on this mountain, against this enemy, meant losing it again in the dark. So he turned to Girk, who had been fighting since first light the previous day, and told him to force march his company around, behind Young's, and punch straight through them onto the peak. Gurkha's men went. Young's men lay down in the dirt, and waited for the artillery to stop falling on the ground in front of them, and then got up and assaulted it, and found the Chinese still stunned and still facing south. Private Jim McFadzean, a signaller in C Company, later summed the whole morning up in 6 words. Surprise, speed and aggression had won the day. Nearly 70 Chinese lay dead when it finished. More than 100 wounded, and 30 dazed prisoners came out of the position. 3 more Australians were killed and 14 wounded, and when the counting was done, just over 35 men of D Company were still on their feet and unhurt. The company was at half strength, and it was finished. And those 35 men stood up and clapped and cheered as Gurkha's company pushed through their lines toward the summit. What followed was an anticlimax, and the battalion had earned it. The guns worked over the peak while Gurkha climbed, and the Chinese, who had watched the eastern approaches fall one after another all day, abandoned the heights before he got there. The final assault consisted of exhausted men climbing on their hands and knees up a slope too steep to walk, to arrive at the top and find a grand view of the surrounding countryside, and 10 prisoners who did not want to fight. The honour of taking a second summit inside 24 hours fell to Maury Piers, who was 21 years old and had been in Korea for 3 months. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 5th of October, Maryang San belonged to Australia. The men on it immediately began tearing apart the Chinese trench system they had captured, because it faced south and they needed it to face every direction at once, and they worked until it was too dark to see. That night, nobody attacked them. It was the first sleep the battalion had had in 4 days, and 2 nights later, they would find out what all the digging had been for. At 7 in the morning on the 6th of October, Lieutenant Arthur Pembroke walked onto a wooded knoll called Sierra with 21 men, expecting to find it empty. It was not empty. There was a large number of Chinese on it, dug in properly, and Pembroke's platoon was under strength, outnumbered, and had no fire support of any kind. They went straight at them with grenades and bayonets and drove more than 100 men off the feature, and then held it for 13 hours under constant shelling, cutting down each counterattack as it came up through the tree line, and making them go back and leave their dead behind them. It cost 1 Australian killed. Pembroke was awarded the Military Cross. 9 months earlier he had been a cadet. 2 ridges to the southwest, The Royal Northumberland Fusiliers were destroying themselves against Hill 217, head-on from the south, straight up the face. It was the exact approach that Hassett had talked Taylor out of. The summit, their own war diary recorded, was a rocky knife edge some 20 yards long, and the ridge was so narrow that a company could only attack with one platoon in front. They took the whole feature except for one knob containing a bunker with 3 medium machine guns in it, and got within 15 yards of it, and never cleared it. They had been in Korea since November of 1950, and their tour was finished, and every man knew it. Ashley Cunningham Booth put it without decoration. We had had more battles than any other British battalion in the Korean War, and enough was enough. In 2 days, they took more than 100 casualties and never reached their objective. The Australians were shooting for them the entire time. The machine gun platoon of the 3rd Battalion had its Vickers guns up on the summit of Maryang San, firing in support of the Fusiliers, and the platoon was commanded by a man named Reg Saunders, who was the first Aboriginal Australian ever to be commissioned as an officer in the Australian Army. His father, Chris, had been a machine gunner in the First World War. His younger brother, Harry, had been killed on the Kokoda track. He had been named after an uncle who won the military medal and was killed in France. Looking up at that mountain before the battle, a fellow officer remarked that it was no country for white men. Saunders told him it was no country for black men either. By the end of that day, it was clear that Hill 217 could not be taken from the south by anyone, and that the only way to it was down the ridge from the north, through the Hinge, which meant that the hill which was the Fusiliers to take was now going to be given to a battalion that had been fighting for 4 days. Taylor had now handed the Australians 2 objectives that belonged to somebody else. They had 1 company left that had not yet been used. Before the assault went in on the 7th, Hassett moved his tactical headquarters forward onto Hill 317 itself, into the captured Chinese trenches on the summit. Lieutenant Peter Scott, the battalion intelligence officer, sat in the trench beside him with the maps and the radio. "That is why we were so very lucky that we did not get a direct hit," Scott remembered. "Otherwise, the battalion headquarters, and the commanding officer, and I, and the battery commander would have all been eliminated very easily. The commanding officer was dashing around everywhere, and I just had to sit there with his radio set." The attack was set for 8 o'clock, and Hassett held it there deliberately, waiting for the fog to burn off, because as long as the fog was down, the guns had to stop early, and as soon as it lifted, they could fire until the last safe moment before his men walked into their own shells. He traded surprise for weight of fire. It was the correct trade, and it cost him nothing, because the Chinese on the Hinge had already worked out something better. B Company came down the ridgeline at 8, 2 platoons up and 1 behind, and it seemed at first as though the position had been abandoned in the night, and then the leading platoons were engulfed by fire from behind them. They had been allowed through. The Chinese had let 2 platoons walk past their positions and then opened up on the company headquarters in the middle of them. The fighting that followed took 80 minutes, and by 9:20 the Hinge had fallen, for 2 Australians killed and 20 wounded. Captain Henry Nichols received the Military Cross. So did Lieutenant Jim Hughes, whose first battle this was, for leading his platoon in a grenade duel against an entire Chinese battalion. Acting Company Sergeant Major Darcy Dudley Eccles was hit in the neck as B Company came up on the Hinge. He was born on the 6th of February, 1926, in Yass, in New South Wales, to Thomas and Gladys Eccles. They carried him back to the regimental aid post and got him onto a helicopter alongside another wounded Australian for the flight to hospital, which was more than most men on that mountain got, and he died in the air on the way there. He was 25 years old. He was buried at the United Nations Military Cemetery at Tangok, and later reinterred at Busan, and his name is on the Roll of Honour at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, Among 399 others who died in Korea, 19 other Australians were killed on Maryang San. Their names were not recorded anywhere the public can reach them, and no source explains who decided that or when. The shelling that followed drove B Company down into the Chinese trenches they had just taken and kept them there, unable to consolidate, unable to move their wounded, running short of ammunition, within hours. It was the worst bombardment the Australians experienced in the entire Korean War. Hassett wrote his own assessment of his battalion at that hour. And it is the most honest sentence any Australian commander produced about that war. Platoons were now down to 15 to 20 strong, he said, too low for orthodox tactical use. It was not just the casualties. Most were physically exhausted. Lack of sleep and battle stress apart, just moving under heavy load, let alone fighting. In hilly, difficult terrain was most demanding. The battalion was just about spent. At 8 o'clock that night, the Chinese guns and mortars opened on the Hinge and on Hill 317 together, and fired for 45 minutes without stopping. And when they lifted, the mist came down and hid what was walking up the ridge underneath it. A great many of them got inside the perimeter before anybody saw them. 3 times that night, a force of battalion strength came at the Hinge, from the front and from both flanks at once, fresh men who had not been in the fighting at all. In the dark, unable to see each other, the Australians shouted 3 words across the position, over and over, and it functioned as a battle cry and a fire order and a reassurance all at once. Watch your front. There was not enough ammunition. One of B Company's 2 Vickers guns was destroyed by a shell, and the men broke up its belts and handed the rounds out among the riflemen, because rounds were rounds and there were men on the parapet with empty magazines. And that is what caused a large number of the mechanical failures and weapon stoppages that followed. The ammunition had been made for a machine gun. Fed into rifles by hand in the dark, it jammed them. The improvisation that kept them shooting was the same thing that stopped them shooting. Not doctrine, not fire support, not the plan that had been written and rewritten by clever men. Belts, rounds, hands, in the dark. When the ammunition was effectively gone, the Australians killed the men who reached them by kicking and strangling and bayoneting them. Not a last stand. Arithmetic. At 5 in the morning on the 8th of October, the Chinese stopped coming. What the light showed was worse than the noise had been. More than 120 Chinese dead and wounded lay around the Australian positions, and Breen, writing for the army, does not soften what else was there. Scores of bodies and body parts, hundreds of them, strewn in front of the wire in the grey. They had not been beaten in the way that word is normally used. What happened is recorded in China's own official history, and it is the enemy's account, not Australia's. In order to preserve its remaining strength, the 191st Division pulled back 3 kilometres and gave up Hill 217 without a fight. Somebody at 64th Army Headquarters had looked at what the mountain was costing and decided that the division was worth more than the ground. 2 ridges away, an entire British battalion had bled itself white for 2 days trying to take that hill. And the Chinese gave it up in a morning because the arithmetic had changed. And then, the strangest hour of the battle. Hassett gave permission for Chinese medical orderlies and stretcher parties to walk forward into the Australian position under a flag of truce and collect their wounded. And they came, and the Australians let them work. 8 hours earlier, these men had been strangling each other in the dark with their hands. Now they were carrying each other's wounded down the hill. Not mercy exactly, not sentiment, and certainly not friendship. Something both sides understood without agreeing on anything else at all. The bill for the mountain was 20 Australians killed and more than 100 wounded, and 5 of the dead had already survived Kapyong. The Fusiliers lost more than 100 and never reached their objective. On Hill 317 itself, 283 Chinese dead were counted by body, and 50 were taken prisoner. Hassett was given an immediate Distinguished Service Order, and Major General James Cassels called what the Australians had done one of the finest battalion actions in British military history. The battalion's decorations for Maryang San came to 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 9 military crosses, 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 9 military medals, and 15 mentions in dispatches. That number is worth remembering. They held it for 28 days. That was the end of the War of Movement. It had lasted 16 months, and Maryang San was its last act. And what came after it was a thing everybody recognized immediately, and nobody had wanted. Trench lines, bunkers, wiring parties, minefields, patrols into no man's land at night. The Western Front of 1915, transplanted to Korea and left there for 2 more years while men argued at Panmunjom. There is one detail from that winter that belongs here and nowhere else. The Chinese crept through the lines in the dead of it, at night, across ground where a man could be shot for existing, and left Christmas gifts on the wire for the Australians in reserve. On the 4th of November, the Chinese came back for the hill. The borderers held it with about 400 men, and 3 battalions came at them out of a bombardment. 6,000 Chinese committed across the sector, and the British were overrun. By first light on the 5th of November, the hill was gone. The borderers lost 7 killed, 87 wounded, and 44 missing in a day. Private Bill Speakman was 24 years old, a Black Watch man attached to the borderers, and he stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. When his company's left shoulder began to collapse, he filled his pockets with grenades and went forward throwing them, and came back for more, and 6 men followed him. When the grenades ran out, they threw stones and ration tins and empty beer bottles. He was hit in the shoulder and hit in the leg and kept going. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, and because King George VI died before he could present it, Bill Speakman became the first man in history to receive an honour from Queen Elizabeth II. Some years later, in financial hardship, he sold it to put a new roof on his cottage. The hill was never retaken. Not in the 19 months of fighting that remained, not at the armistice, and not since. The most important thing the Chinese took off Maryang San was not the hill. During the fighting, one Chinese company had defended its position out of a U-shaped tunnel dug into the mountain, large enough to hold 100 men, which served as a bomb shelter while the artillery was falling, and as a base to counterattack from the moment it stopped. Its commander wrote a report claiming that the tunnel had allowed his men to inflict 700 casualties on United Nations troops while suffering 21. That figure is almost certainly inflated, and there is no way to check it. It did not need to be true to be useful. Peng Dehuai, commanding all Chinese forces in Korea, read that report and ordered tunnels 30 meters deep dug along the entire length of the front line, and the system that resulted became one of the hardest problems United Nations forces faced for the rest of the war. The Australians won the hill. The Chinese won the lesson. Why did the men who took Maryang San receive fewer decorations than the men who lost it? Why was the capture of the hill not recognized as a battle honor at all, while its loss was? Why was the brigadier who delivered every objective he had been given removed from his command within weeks of delivering them? The first question was answered by Australia's own official historian, in Australia's own official history, in a sentence that has never been improved upon. The King's own Scottish borderers, Robert O'Neill wrote, had gained more decorations in losing Maryang San to the Chinese on the 4th of November than the Australians had received for winning it on the 8th of October. The second answer is worse. The capture was not recognised as a separate battle honour. It was folded into the wider brigade honour of Maryang San and disappeared inside it. And then the honour Maryang San was created, and it was awarded to the King's Own Scottish Borderers and to the Royal Leicestershire Regiment for the battle in November, for losing it. The 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment did not receive Maryang San as a battle honour of its own until 1994. 43 years. The third answer nobody has ever put on paper. George Taylor took every objective his division gave him, and he was removed with little warning, and Lieutenant Colonel John MacDonald of the Borderers got the brigade. Hassett wrote to Taylor about it 36 years afterwards. "I think one of your senior officers was very ambitious," he said. Perhaps that was part of the trouble, all of which built, over 70 years, into a story that Australians tell about Maryang San, and one part of that story is not true. The story is that C Company took Little Gibraltar and handed it to the British. It is in the memoirs, it is in the atlases, it is in books published as recently as this century. And in 2020, a British historian named Nigel Steele published a chapter in a volume issued by an Australian university press, having gone into the National Archives and read the war diaries, and the war diaries do not support it. At 4 minutes past 11 on the morning of the 4th of October, the brigade recorded that the Borderers had captured the summit at 11 o'clock. At 11:30, the battalion diary confirms it. By 12:30, their hold was consolidated. Girk made his radio call at 2 in the afternoon, reporting the Borderers still below the summit. They had been standing on it for 3 hours. And then, in 2011, the historian sat down with an Australian who had been there. Maury Pearse, who won his military cross on that mountain, explained the thing that 70 years of argument had missed. The crest of Little Gibraltar is shallow. It rises and falls 50 metres around the summit. A man standing on one side of it cannot see the other side. Gurkha was not lying, and Girk was not exaggerating. He was on the eastern shoulder. The Borderers were on the peak. Neither could see the other, and both of them told the truth for the rest of their lives, and both of them were wrong. The British historian Michael Hickey had already found the only sentence that fits. Both units were to claim correctly that they had taken Little Gibraltar, for neither would have got there without the unseen support of the other. The 33-year-old who had never commanded in battle went on to run the Australian Army. In November of 1975, Frank Hassett became Chief of the Defence Force Staff, the professional head of the entire Australian military. His eldest son Michael was killed in a vehicle accident that same year. He died in Canberra in 2008, aged 90. He ran the whole Australian Defence Force, and the hill he is remembered for is still empty. The paperwork was right, and the men were right, and nobody had lied about anything. Which leaves only the question of why a country that had a battle like this one spent 70 years telling itself a slightly different story about it. Darcy Eccles never came home to Yass. James Cron never came home to Garliston. Reg Saunders came home, and in 1953 the Returned and Services League put his name forward for Australia's contingent to the Queen's coronation, and the government said no. 320 men took that mountain with a battalion. Their own commander called a transit camp, using a plan a brigadier was sacked for succeeding with, capturing 2 objectives that belonged to somebody else. It was gone in 28 days. The enemy took the lesson they had paid for and dug it into the ground along the whole length of the front. The honour was given to the men who lost the hill, and the men who won it waited 43 years for theirs. And the distance between the quality of those soldiers and the quality of the decisions that spent them is the distance in which the real history of the Korean War is written. In 2016, Peter Scott went back. He stood on the ceasefire line with 7 other veterans and looked north across 3,000 or 4,000 metres of empty ground at Hill 317, which he had been sitting on top of with a radio set 65 years earlier, while the shells came down. It was very quiet and peaceful there, he said. Frank Hassett had the last word on his own men, and it is not the word anybody expects. There were no heroes welcome home for these warriors, he wrote. They left from Australia as individuals or in small groups and returned the same way, unheralded and unsung. Somehow, it did not seem to matter. There was much quiet satisfaction just knowing that one had fought at Maryang San. Nobody has stood on that mountain since 1953. The mist still comes up off the Imjin every morning and fills the valleys the way it did on the 5th of October, and there is no one on the hill to be hidden by it. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand why the 20th century's forgotten wars were forgotten on purpose, watch this next.